There are stories that whisper in the corridors of time, stories that never quite die, because the silence around them speaks louder than answers ever could. In the quiet hills of a remote village in northern Italy, Sister Clara vanished without a trace in the spring of 1981. One moment, she was walking through the monastery garden after evening prayers, humming a hymn only she seemed to know. The next, she was gone, leaving behind no sign, no sound, no shadow. Authorities searched, locals prayed, and whispers turned into legends. But what truly chills the soul is what happened more than 3 decades later. It was an ordinary renovation, a crumbling estate being restored after decades of neglect. Deep beneath the foundation, locked behind a cellar door that no key seemed to fit, workers made a discovery that stunned even the most seasoned among them. There, in the dust and darkness, untouched by time, lay a single object, a rosary. But not just any rosary. It was Sister Clara's, the same one she wore every day, the one engraved with her initials, the one declared missing alongside her. The cellar had been sealed from the inside, the walls untouched, and no record of its existence had ever been found in any blueprint. What happened that spring evening? How could something so sacred, so personal, reappear in a place no one even knew existed after 32 years of silence? Those who held the rosary claimed it was still warm, as if recently touched. Some believe it's a sign. Others say it's a message. But a few, those who knew Sister Clara, swear she used to speak of dreams. Dreams of being trapped. Dreams of prayers echoing from beneath the earth. This isn't just a mystery about a missing nun. It's a story wrapped in faith, fear, and the unexplainable. It forces us to question what lingers in the spaces we forget, what hides in locked doors and buried rooms. And it leaves us with a single, haunting question. Did Sister Clara ever leave that monastery at all? Because sometimes, the most terrifying answers aren't found in what we see, but in what returns to us, long after it should have been forgotten. The investigation into Sister Clara's disappearance began with a kind of quiet urgency. The sisters of the convent, deeply rooted in their daily rituals and cloistered life, had no language for panic. They prayed. They lit candles. They waited. But as the hours turned to days and the days to weeks, the absence of the young nun became unbearable. Clara wasn't just a presence in the monastery. She was its heart. Known for her compassion, her unwavering faith, and her gentle voice, she brought warmth even to the coldest corners of the convent's stone halls. Local authorities had little to go on. There were no signs of struggle, no forced entry, and no witnesses beyond those who saw her last on the garden path. The village priest, Father Domenico, described it as if she had simply dissolved into thin air. For a time, the town was haunted not by what they knew, but by what they didn't. Rumors circulated. Some whispered of a forbidden love, others of a spirit haunting the monastery grounds. But none of these theories made sense to those who truly knew Clara. Her belongings were left untouched. Her diary, though filled with thoughtful reflections and prayers, gave no indication of distress. Yet one entry, written 2 nights before she vanished, began to raise quiet alarm among investigators. In it, she mentioned a voice in the cellar. The convent had no cellar. At least, none that anyone living could recall. That single line sent shivers down Father Domenico's spine, but the sisters chose silence over speculation. It was, after all, easier to believe in miracles than to confront secrets. As months slipped into years, the case went cold. The rosary, the one item that might have connected her to something tangible, was missing until now. That object had always been with her, wrapped around her wrist like a silent promise. Its reappearance in a sealed cellar reignited questions everyone had tried to bury. Could she have been trapped? Was the voice she mentioned real? And why was no one able to hear her cries, if there were cries at all? What disturbed people most was not the mystery of how she vanished, but the unbearable thought that she might have never been far at all. That beneath their prayers, beneath the chapel, beneath the very foundation of their lives, Clara was still there, not as a spirit, but as a secret waiting to be unearthed. The workers who discovered the rosary were not locals, and perhaps that distance allowed them to see what the villagers couldn't, or wouldn't. It was a quiet morning, when one of them struck a hollow patch beneath a crumbling wall. What they uncovered wasn't just a room. It was a chamber, small and windowless, with walls stained by time and silence. Dust choked the air, but there was something unsettling about how undisturbed everything looked. In the very center of the floor, as though placed with purpose, was the rosary. It didn't take long for word to spread. The village, though aged and weary, stirred with the weight of history clawing back to the surface. Older residents remembered Sister Clara, her kindness, her songs in the chapel. And while some welcomed the news with curiosity, others met it with dread. There had always been stories of secret rooms, of echoes in the walls at night, but no one had dared believe them. Now, they could no longer afford not to. Father Domenico, now in his 80s and frail in frame, but not in spirit, was escorted to the site. Upon seeing the rosary, he wept, not with joy, but with a sorrow so deep it silenced the gathered crowd. He recognized the engraving immediately. CLS. Clara Lucia Santoro. He touched it like one touches a wound. And as he stood there, tears slipping down his lined face, he whispered something that no one around him understood. She knew. The discovery forced a reopening of the investigation, but time had eroded more than evidence. The convent had been partially renovated over the decades, and many who had once lived or worked there had since passed on. However, one woman, Sister Beatrice, who had once shared a room with Clara, remained. Her memory was sharp, and her eyes still held the fire of a younger self. When asked about the cellar, she hesitated. "We were told never to go below the eastern corridor," she said. "They said it was unsafe or cursed." That corridor had long been sealed off, its original plans missing from every archive. But the fact that Clara mentioned a voice from below made everything different now. What if she had gone there? What if she found something she was never meant to see? And worse, what if someone knew she did? Sister Beatrice sat quietly in the old chapel, her hands trembling as they clutched the edges of her sleeves. Clara was curious, she said after a long pause. Too curious. She would ask questions others avoided, about the sealed corridor, about the origins of the convent itself. Her voice faltered, not from age, but from memory. She recalled a night, just days before Clara disappeared, when she found her kneeling outside the eastern passage, praying, not like someone seeking peace, but like someone begging. The journals of the convent, kept meticulously by the Mother Superior, offered no help. The year 1981 had an entire month missing from its pages. When pressed, the current leadership of the convent claimed the books were lost during a fire that damaged part of the archives. But Sister Beatrice shook her head. There was no fire, she said, her voice now sharpened by something close to fear. That month wasn't lost. It was erased. Among the villagers, more whispers emerged. One old man, Enzo, remembered working as a delivery boy for the convent in his teens. He recalled hearing loud banging sounds one night as he passed the chapel, sounds he described as not human. At the time, he dismissed it as wind or wild animals. But after hearing about the rosary, the memory returned with startling clarity. "I didn't imagine it," he said. Someone was crying from inside the stone. With the discovery of the rosary, people began to revisit areas of the convent that had been abandoned for years. The floorboards in the eastern corridor groaned underfoot, and the air there felt different, stale, heavy, as if holding its breath. In the back of the hall, hidden behind layers of decaying plaster, they found a narrow staircase leading downward. It wasn't on any map. It wasn't in any record. Yet it was there, carved in stone, descending into darkness that seemed untouched by time. The further they went, the colder it became. Not the chill of underground stone, but a cold that settled into bones, into memory, into something deeper. The group that explored the stairs didn't speak much afterward. One of the workers quit the next day and left the village altogether. Another refused to return to the site. Only one man, a historian named Paolo who had joined the team out of fascination, stayed behind. And what he found in the chamber below would change everything they thought they knew. The chamber beneath the stairs was unlike anything Paolo had expected. It was not crude or hastily constructed. It was deliberate, ornate in a disturbing way. Symbols covered the walls, some religious, others indecipherable. In the center stood a stone pedestal, cracked with age, and on it, an old, rusted key. But what truly made his breath catch was the inscription above the arch. Et in tenebris, clamavit illa. And in the darkness, she cried out. Paolo took photographs, but the camera malfunctioned shortly after. The images he did capture came out distorted, with streaks of light cutting through the frame like open wounds. Yet what he couldn't capture was the feeling, the sense that something had watched him, followed him back up the stairs. That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept hearing faint whispers, not in words, but in tones. And one phrase kept repeating in his mind, though he swore he never heard it aloud. She never left. Meanwhile, Sister Beatrice fell ill. Her condition deteriorated rapidly, as if something unseen had returned with Paolo from the depths. In her final days, she scribbled notes feverishly, many incoherent, others hauntingly clear. One note read, "She was taken for what she knew. She found the passage. She found the truth." Another simply said, "Forgive me, Clara. I didn't stop them." Paolo, now obsessed, began digging into the history of the convent, uncovering documents buried in forgotten archives. He discovered that the land it stood on was once home to a pagan temple, long before the church claimed it. The eastern corridor, he learned, was built over what had once been a subterranean chamber used for rituals. The church had sealed it, sanctified the ground, and built the convent as an act of redemption. But Clara had found it, and that had sealed her fate. More than just a mystery, it was now a question of belief. Had Clara uncovered something the convent meant to keep buried forever? And if so, was the reappearance of her rosary a sign of justice, or a warning? The past, it seemed, was not finished with them, and whatever had been hidden in the darkness was no longer content to remain silent. After Sister Beatrice's death, her final notes were passed to Paolo. They were cryptic, often fragmented, but one detail stood out with chilling clarity, a sketch. It was a drawing of the eastern corridor's door as it looked before being sealed, marked with symbols that matched those found in the hidden chamber. At the bottom, she had written, "Only the innocent may enter. Only the chosen may leave." It was unclear whether this was a warning, a riddle, or a memory. But to Paolo, it felt like all three. Driven by a sense of duty, or perhaps guilt, Paolo returned to the underground chamber, this time alone. He brought with him the rusted key from the pedestal, uncertain what it would unlock. Deep inside, he discovered a second door, almost invisible against the stone, as if carved to remain hidden. The key fit. With a groaning echo that seemed to stretch beyond time, the door opened into another room, smaller, colder, and suffocatingly quiet. Inside, there was nothing but a single wooden chair, decayed and darkened by age. But on it, something impossible, the remains of a habit, the traditional garment worn by the nuns, folded neatly, preserved, and on top of it, a single note, written in delicate, faded ink, "I kept faith, even in silence." The handwriting, though old, matched entries from Clara's diary. Paolo stood frozen, overwhelmed not by fear, but by sorrow. He wasn't looking at evidence. He was looking at a farewell. The note raised an unbearable question. Had Clara written it herself? And if so, when? Was she alive in that room for days? Weeks? Years? The possibility that she had been held captive beneath the convent while prayers were said above her, while songs of worship echoed through the chapel walls, was almost too painful to accept. Yet everything pointed to it. Clara hadn't run. She hadn't vanished. She had been buried alive by secrets. When Paolo emerged, he was different. Not broken, but changed. The weight of what he had seen was now part of him. He didn't speak of it to many, but he kept the note. And every Sunday, he returned to the chapel, not to pray, but to listen, not to speak, but to remember. Because now, more than ever, he believed that Clara had never truly left, that her voice was still there, somewhere between the stone and the silence, waiting for someone to hear her. Whispers of the discovery spread far beyond the village. Journalists, historians, even spiritual investigators arrived, each with their own angle, their own belief in what had happened. But no article, no photo, no television segment could truly capture the gravity of what the town had lived with for more than 3 decades. Because this wasn't just about a nun. It was about trust, betrayal, silence, and the unbearable weight of what people choose to ignore. Some tried to explain it logically. They called it an old passage forgotten by history, a tragic accident. But others saw patterns too deliberate to dismiss. Clara's diary hinted at something older, something spiritual, possibly malevolent, that had been awakened. And the fact that the convent had erased an entire month from its records, that was not coincidence. That was control. Villagers began sharing stories they had never told before. One man remembered hearing faint hymns late at night, long after the chapel had closed. Another, a woman who once cleaned the convent, recalled hearing sobs from behind the eastern wall, but was told it was just the pipes. All these years, the signs had been there, but no one wanted to see them. No one wanted to believe something so sacred could also be a place of darkness. And then there was the dog. A stray that often wandered near the convent grounds had been found lying outside the sealed corridor the night Clara disappeared, whimpering and refusing to move. Old Sister Helena, long retired, remembered it vividly. It was like he was waiting for her, she said, like he knew she was still inside. After that night, the dog vanished too. Another silence in a story full of them. Now, decades later, the convent stands quiet again, but the silence is different. Heavier. Not of peace, but of mourning. Not of holiness, but of unfinished prayers. Clara's rosary is now kept in a glass case inside the chapel, but it is not treated as a relic. It is a reminder that even in the most sacred places, truth can be buried. And if you're not careful, it could take someone with it. Paolo began documenting every detail of the discovery, not for publication, but to ensure the truth wouldn't be buried again. He compiled journals, photographs, transcriptions, and recordings, many of which captured faint, inexplicable sounds from within the walls of the convent. He created a private archive he called the Clara Files. In the margins of one entry, he wrote, "The silence of the sacred is not always holy. Sometimes it hides screams." That sentence would haunt him for years. The church sent a delegation after word of the discovery spread. 3 priests and a historian arrived, not to investigate, but to contain. They dismissed the chamber as a medieval storage room. They claimed the rosary must have fallen through cracks during construction decades earlier. But when asked about the second room, the sealed chamber, they offered no answers. And when Paolo tried to present Clara's final note, they refused to touch it. One of them muttered a Latin prayer under his breath, and their presence brought unease to the village. Locals who had once trusted the church without question now looked at it with quiet suspicion. It wasn't rebellion, it was grief. The revelation had fractured something deeper than belief. It wasn't about theology, it was about truth. And truth, in this case, had a face, a name. A rosary once held by hands now long turned to dust. Paolo's research uncovered another layer. In a dusty, neglected regional archive, he found a letter dated March of 1978, 3 years before Clara vanished. It was addressed to the bishop of the region and written by a former nun named Elisabetta. In it, she warned of strange practices still held beneath the chapel, claiming that certain corridors should be closed forever before another innocent is lost. Her letter was marked unfounded and destroyed. Yet here it was, forgotten, but that name, Elisabetta, appeared again in one of Clara's last diary entries. "I found the writings of Sister," she had penned. "She warned me. She knew. And now, I know too." The connections tightened. The church had known, or at least some within it had. And if Clara had read those warnings, it meant she didn't wander blindly into the dark. She chose to go, not for curiosity, but to uncover a truth buried by time, by fear, and by obedience. The more Paolo uncovered, the more personal the story became. Clara stopped being a mystery. She became a martyr of silence, of secrecy, of faith weaponized by fear. And through her writings, a portrait emerged not of a victim, but of a seeker. She wrote not with despair, but with conviction. "If I am not heard," one entry read, "then let my prayers echo through the stones until someone finally listens." Among the most disturbing discoveries was a fragment of an old confession log. It was unsigned and undated, but described locking the girl away and doing what was necessary for the good of the order. It wasn't clear who had written it, but it was filed during the spring of 1981. The handwriting did not match Father Domenico's or any known clergy. Yet its presence confirmed what had once been only fear. Clara had been silenced, deliberately. Paolo, now isolated in his work, faced pressure to stop. Letters from unnamed senders warned him to leave the convent's past buried. His funding was quietly revoked. His lectures were canceled. But he pressed on, because every time he looked at Clara's note, I kept faith, even in silence. He felt a responsibility to ensure her voice didn't die with the bricks that held her in. Local children began reporting dreams of a woman in white, standing in the chapel corridor, holding a rosary that glowed faintly in the dark. Some dismissed it as superstition. Others, including a few of the nuns, believed Clara's spirit remained, not to haunt, but to protect, as if her presence now served as a quiet guardian, ensuring the truth she died for was never forgotten again. In the years that followed, the convent transformed. The eastern corridor was opened permanently, converted into a place of remembrance. A simple plaque hangs on the stone. She was never lost. We simply refused to see. The villagers light candles there every March, the month Clara vanished. And every year, Paolo returns to sit in silence, knowing that somewhere in the stillness, she is listening. The discovery of the corridor brought with it an emotional reckoning that the entire village struggled to process. For decades, they had lived beneath the weight of unanswered prayers. The convent, once a place of spiritual refuge, now stood as both sanctuary and tomb. And yet, from the tragedy, a quiet transformation began. People spoke more openly, not just about Clara, but about their own secrets, their own wounds. The silence that had once suffocated them began to unravel, thread by fragile thread. Among those who came forward was an elderly nun named Sister Teresa, who had remained silent for over 40 years. She confessed to hearing Clara's voice, faint, pleading, on the night of her disappearance. She had gone to the Mother Superior, only to be warned never to speak of it again. It wasn't fear that kept me quiet, she said with tears in her eyes. It was obedience, blind, cruel obedience. Her admission, late though it was, validated what many already believed. Clara had cried out, and no one. But Sister Teresa revealed one more piece of the puzzle, something she had never told a soul. A week before Clara vanished, she had seen a young nun holding a parchment, old and brittle, written in Latin. Clara claimed it contained instructions to unlock the Chamber of Shadows, and that the truth beneath the convent was older than the church itself. Teresa hadn't believed her then, but now, she wondered if Clara had uncovered something forbidden, something meant to stay buried. The parchment, unfortunately, was never found, but references to it appeared again in another strange place. A letter from the bishop, stored in a diocesan archive in Rome, which Paolo was granted access to only after months of petitioning. The letter expressed concern over a rising interest among the sisters in heretical texts discovered during the renovation. It ended with a chilling directive. Silence is our shield. Remove the temptation. Remove the voice. Dated April of 1981. That letter changed everything. It was no longer a story about a missing nun. It was a cover-up. Institutional. Deliberate. Sanctified by hierarchy. And Clara, with her gentle spirit and relentless faith, had walked straight into it, eyes wide open. Not because she was naive, but because she believed the truth would protect her. She was wrong, and now, her story had become something more than history. It had become a mirror, reflecting what happens when silence is chosen over justice. Paolo's health began to decline. Years of research, spiritual weight, and emotional burden had taken a toll on his body. But his mind remained sharp, focused on one final goal: publishing the Clara Testament, a book that would document every truth uncovered, every injustice silenced, every page of Clara's diary. Not for fame, not even for vengeance, but so the world would remember her not as a footnote in a mystery, but as a woman who gave her life in pursuit of light. He worked tirelessly, surrounded by Clara's writings, Beatrice's notes, and his own journal entries. At night, he would often hear soft footsteps in the corridor outside his study. Once, he claimed to see a shadow pause at his door, small, feminine, still, He never felt fear, only calm. "If it's her," he once said, "then she's making sure I finish." The day the Clara Testament was printed, Paolo wept. He placed the first copy beneath the statue of Saint Agnes in the chapel, alongside Clara's rosary. "You kept faith," he whispered, "and now the world will hear you." The book, though never widely promoted, found its way into the hands of truth seekers, scholars, and survivors of other silences. Its final chapter contained only Clara's last known words: "Let truth rise from stone, and let no one bury it again." Strangely, after the book's release, several strange events occurred in the village. A cracked wall in the convent's eastern wing suddenly collapsed, revealing another narrow passage, previously unknown. Inside, they found a wooden cross carved into the stone, with a second note wedged behind it. It read, "He will find this when he is ready." The handwriting matched Clara's. No one knows how she knew, or if, somehow, she continues to guide those who dare to look beyond appearances. But one thing is certain: Clara's voice, once silenced, now speaks louder than ever. And those who once turned away are now the ones lighting candles at her name. Because in the end, faith without truth is just another form of darkness. The newly uncovered passage behind the collapsed wall ignited fresh waves of curiosity and reverence. This wasn't just stone and mortar anymore. It was sacred ground, a place where one woman's truth had pierced through layers of deception and fear. The passage was short, leading to a small alcove that seemed more like a shrine than a room. On the walls were faint handprints, smudged with age, and in the center, a wooden box. Inside it, a second rosary, different from the first, older, and a single slip of. The villagers now regarded Clara not as a ghost of the past, but as a spiritual presence whose message transcended time. The convent began holding monthly vigils, not of mourning, but of remembrance and reflection. Survivors of other institutional silences, some from other countries, began traveling to the chapel, lighting candles beneath her plaque, tracing her name with trembling fingers. The once forgotten corridor had become a sanctuary of healing. But not all were ready to embrace this transformation. A few members of the church hierarchy attempted to dismiss the recent discoveries as unverified folklore. They argued that no official record could confirm Clara had been intentionally imprisoned, that any conclusions drawn were speculative at best. But the village had learned its lesson. Truth did not need permission to exist. It had already rooted itself in their soil, in their hearts, and no declaration from above could remove it. In response, Paolo published a second volume, The Forgotten Light. It wasn't just about Clara anymore. It chronicled other cases, other voices swallowed by silence. He named names. He traced timelines. He cross-referenced forgotten letters, lost confessions, sealed archives. It became a work of reckoning, not bitter, but unflinching. In it, he wrote, "The church is not evil, but when it fears truth more than it fears sin, it builds dungeons disguised as sanctuaries." That sentence would become one of the most quoted in the years to come. Clara's story had awakened something dormant in people. Not rebellion, but conscience. And in a world so often eager to forget, her quiet resistance reminded many that remembrance is an act of defiance. One candle, one name, one prayer whispered not out of habit, but out of hope that one day, no voice would ever have to fight this hard to be heard. Among the many who read The Forgotten Light was a young novice named Lucia. She had been preparing for her vows when she stumbled upon Clara's story. It shook her, not because it made her question her faith, but because it deepened it. Clara wasn't a scandal. She was a prophet, a warning wrapped in devotion. Lucia began writing letters to other convents, sharing what she had learned. "If obedience blinds us to injustice," she wrote, "then we are not serving God. We are serving fear." Her words caught fire. Slowly, letters came back, some in secret, some open, all echoing the same thought. Clara had become more than a memory. She had become a movement. A quiet reform was brewing, not in headlines or papal decrees, but in whispered conversations, hidden journals, midnight prayers of women rediscovering their strength through hers. One of the most powerful moments came during the annual vigil in Clara's village. Lucia, now a fully professed nun, was invited to speak. She stood in the candlelit chapel, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "We are not here to reopen wounds," she said. "We are here because one woman dared to seek truth in the silence. She didn't curse the darkness. She lit a flame, and we're the ones carrying it now." The crowd, made of villagers, clergy, students, and strangers, rose in silent unity. For a moment, the chapel felt as if it were holding its breath. Not out of fear, but awe. Outside, the bell tower rang once, and many swore. In that moment of perfect stillness, they heard a second ring follow, soft, distant, echoing from below. Paolo, now aged and wheelchair-bound, sat in the front pew with tears in his eyes. He turned to Lucia and whispered, "She's proud of you." Lucia nodded. "She's proud of you," she replied. And for the first time in decades, Paolo smiled. Not from relief, but from peace. Because what had begun as a mystery had become a legacy. And that legacy now lived on in every person brave enough to listen to the voice that no wall could hold back. In the months that followed, the chapel where Clara's rosary rested became more than a place of worship. It became a destination for pilgrimage. But unlike traditional pilgrimages marked by relics or miracles, this one drew people seeking truth, survivors of silence, seekers of clarity, families torn apart by secrets too long ignored. They didn't come expecting healing. They came because someone, once voiceless, had spoken. And in that echo, they found themselves. Lucia began organizing gatherings for young nuns and novices, creating safe spaces to talk openly about fears, questions, even doubts. She called them the Clara Circles. What began with 6 women in a single room became dozens across the country, then hundreds. "We do not defy the church," she would say. "We refine it." Her mission wasn't rebellion. It was remembrance. And through that remembrance, reformation. One particular visitor left a mark on everyone. An elderly woman named Elisabetta. Yes, the same nun whose letter Paolo had discovered years ago, was still alive, living in obscurity in a convent by the sea. She had lived all those years in silence, believing no one had ever read her warning. But now, standing before Clara's plaque, she whispered, "You heard me. And now, I hear you." Her eyes welled with tears as she placed a tiny white lily at the base of the glass case. Lucia embraced her, and they sat for hours under the stone archway of the chapel. Elisabetta shared stories never written, moments of fear, dreams she had buried, guilt she had carried. She confessed she had once tried to break the seal of the Eastern Corridor herself, but was stopped. "I wasn't brave enough," she said. Lucia smiled softly. "But Clara was, and your voice led her there. You lit the path, even if you never walked it." And so, from one generation of silence to another of strength, the torch was passed, not with fanfare or ritual, but with a shared glance, a quiet vow. Clara had started something bigger than herself, something timeless. Her suffering had not been in vain. It had become the seed of truth planted in stone, and now it was blooming across the world. Meanwhile, the Vatican could no longer remain silent. Pressure mounted, not just from the faithful, but from within. Cardinals, bishops, even young priests began referencing Clara in homilies, lectures, private memos. A motion was introduced to formally acknowledge her case, not as martyrdom in the traditional sense, but as a symbol of truth in silence. It was a term the church had never used before, and one that many resisted. But the momentum was undeniable. A special council was formed to examine the records. Paolo, though frail, was invited to testify. He wore a simple suit and carried with him a copy of the Clara Testament, now in its 3rd printing. He spoke not with anger, but with clarity. "The church does not fear truth," he told the council, "but men within it have." He ended his statement with a phrase that echoed through the chamber. To bury a voice is not to silence it. It is to give it roots. After days of deliberation, the church issued a public statement. Not an apology, but an acknowledgement. It recognized Clara Lucia Santoro as a figure of conscience, whose faith endured through silence, and whose story shall not be forgotten. It was not canonization. It was not justice. But it was something, a beginning. For the village, the announcement brought closure, but not finality. Clara's story was no longer theirs alone. It belonged to the world. Journalists returned. Filmmakers requested rights. Academics debated her legacy. But the villagers, those who had lit candles in her name for over 3 decades, simply nodded. They already knew what others were just beginning to understand. That same year, a young girl named Clara was born in the village. Her parents named her not in sorrow, but in strength. And at her baptism, held in the very chapel where the Rosary was discovered, Lucia held the child in her arms and whispered, "May your voice never be silenced." And the bells rang, not once, but twice, clear and bright, echoing through stone and sky. Years passed, and yet the light Clara had sparked only grew. Across continents, her story found its way into classrooms, spiritual retreats, human rights panels, and underground gatherings where survivors of silence found the courage to speak for the first time. Clara was no longer seen only as a nun. She had become a symbol of what happens when faith and truth walk hand in hand, even into the dark. Her story did not ask for pity. It demanded presence, awareness, courage. In Rome, a stained glass window was commissioned in a small chapel often visited by young novices. It depicted a woman kneeling beneath stone, hands folded around a glowing rosary, while light pierced through a crack in the wall. At the bottom of the frame, the inscription read, "She kept faith, even in silence." Nuns from around the world would sit before it, some in tears, some in quiet awe. It wasn't just beauty, it was reminder. And reminders, in a world built on forgetting, are sacred. Back in the village, Lucia had taken over stewardship of the convent. But under her guidance, it was no longer a place of imposed silence. It had become a sanctuary of healing. Former nuns who had once left in anguish returned, not for absolution, but for understanding. Women of all backgrounds came to listen, to share, and to walk the corridors Clara once knew. The Eastern Passage, once sealed by fear, now echoed with footsteps of purpose. One particular visitor came in the quiet of winter. A man, older, cloaked in a dark coat, walked slowly to the plaque, knelt, and left behind a single ring. It was inscribed with initials no one recognized. When Lucia found it, she felt a chill run through her. On the band was a date, April 12, 1981, the day Clara vanished. No name, no note, just a symbol. Some believed it was left by someone once complicit, others by someone once silenced. Either way, it became another thread in A.T. Clara's rosary, once lost in a cellar of shadows, had become a global icon. But it was never treated as a relic of worship. It was treated as testimony, a silent object that had traveled across time, through fear, and into the hands of those brave enough to hold it. Not because it held power, but because it held truth. And truth, when protected in silence, becomes louder than any voice. By the time Paolo passed away, he was regarded as a quiet giant of moral scholarship. Not a prophet, not a hero, but a man who had simply refused to look away. His funeral was held in the village chapel, and on his casket lay 2 things, the Clara Testament and a single lily. The same kind Elisabetta had once placed at the plaque. Lucia spoke briefly at the service. "He listened," she said. "He listened when no one else did." And because of that, Clara speaks still. After his death, Paolo's personal archive was donated to a university dedicated to historical theology. It included pages never published, notes Clara had written but never dated. Some believed they were meant for someone she hoped would one day find her. Others thought they were confessions, soft, painful truths from a soul who knew her time was ending. But within them, one line stood out above all. "If you find this, do not weep for me. Weep for the silence that buried me." That line would be etched into the stone beside her plaque. Not beneath it, beside it, as if Clara and her truth stood side by side, equal and enduring. And from that day forward, no vigil was held without someone reading those words aloud, so that the silence they came from would never be repeated again. Lucia continued her work, now expanding beyond convents. She helped launch an international program called The Voice Beneath, which offered education and protection to women in spiritual institutions around the world. Its motto, "No corridor stays sealed. No voice stays buried." Clara's story had become a blueprint, not of tragedy, but of transformation. Even skeptics could no longer deny the impact. Churches began to open records. Victims were offered reparations. Doors long locked were quietly opened. And though not every story had Clara's ending, hers had opened the path for them to begin. Because the story of one nun in a quiet village had reminded the world that truth, no matter how deep it's buried, has a way of rising through the cracks. And in the silence that followed those final words of every vigil, the bells would always ring. Once then twice, not to mark her loss, but to honor the return of her voice. As the voice beneath continued to expand, something unexpected began to happen. Survivors from outside religious institutions, orphans, students, even political prisoners, began referencing Clara's name in their testimonies. Her story, though rooted in a convent silence, had crossed boundaries. It had become universal. She represented anyone who had ever spoken the truth and been punished for it. Anyone who had once whispered into the dark, unsure if anyone would ever hear. Lucia received letters from across the globe. A girl in Argentina who had escaped an abusive sect. A former monk in Ireland who had rediscovered his voice after reading the Clara Testament. A group of women in Ethiopia who now met weekly to share their stories under Clara's name. Some signed their letters. Others didn't. But all of them ended with the same line: I kept faith, even in silence. Meanwhile, the convent's eastern corridor, once the darkest part of the entire structure, had become its brightest. A local artist, inspired by Clara's writings, painted a mural that stretched from floor to ceiling. It depicted a robed woman standing between light and shadow, her rosary breaking apart into doves. Each dove carried a letter, some unfinished, others faded, symbolizing the messages that never reached the world. The mural wasn't just art. It was confession. It was witness. One afternoon, a young seminarian visiting from Ghana sat alone in front of the mural for hours. When asked why he stayed so long, he said, "Because I wanted to hear the silence she left behind." That sentence was later carved into a stone bench placed just beneath the painting. Pilgrims would sit there, not to pray, but to listen. And in that listening, they honored Clara more than any sermon ever could. As the anniversary of Clara's disappearance approached its 40th year, the village prepared not a memorial, but a celebration. Not of her death, but of her voice. Musicians rehearsed hymns based on her diary. Children painted lanterns that would be released into the night sky. And Lucia, now with silver strands in her hair, wrote a speech that would remind the world of a truth often forgotten. Clara was not taken by darkness. She was betrayed by silence. But she rose in the voice of every soul who reappeared. The celebration began as the sun set behind the hills, casting golden light over the chapel's ancient stones. People from dozens of countries filled the small square, some devout, some curious, all moved. Candles lined the streets, and every window in the village held a single flame. The church bells rang once, then twice. The crowd fell silent, not out of ritual, but out of reverence, for a story that had once been buried was now fully alive among them. Lucia stood before the gathered crowd, holding a worn copy of Clara's diary. Her voice trembled at first, but grew steady as she read aloud one of Clara's final entries. "If they bury me, let them bury the truth with me, because I know truth cannot stay buried long. It will rise. It always rises." As those words left her lips, a hush swept the square. Not of grief, but of awe. There was no need to explain the meaning. It was already understood by everyone. After the reading, one by one, people stepped forward to light their lanterns. Each lantern bore a name, not just Clara's, but names of others who had once been silenced. Names whispered, names written, names remembered. As the lanterns lifted into the night sky, guided by gentle winds, it seemed as though the stars themselves were making room. Children pointed upward. Elders wept. And somewhere, in the middle of the crowd, someone whispered, "She sees this." Among the crowd was a woman no one recognized. She wore a long gray coat and a rosary around her neck. When asked who she was, she only smiled and said, "I was once a sister. I am now a witness." She placed a small white envelope at the base of the chapel wall and disappeared into the crowd. Inside the envelope were two things: a photo of Clara, smiling, and a quote written in soft, looping script. We prayed above. She waited below. Now we rise together. The night ended not with applause, but with silence. A sacred, full silence. Not the kind that hides pain, but the kind that holds it gently. A silence that remembered, that honored, that listened. And as the final candle was extinguished in the chapel, the glow remained. Not on the walls, not on the floor, but in the hearts of those who now knew. Some voices are never lost. They are simply waiting for someone brave enough to hear them. In the days following the commemoration, something profound shifted, not just in the village, but in the people who had come from far and wide. The story of Sister Clara had become more than a memory or even a movement. It had become a map, a guide for those navigating the shadowed spaces of their own pasts. And in the silence she once endured, many began to hear something they hadn't dared to listen for in years: themselves. Lucia received an unexpected letter from a convent in Japan. Inside was a single sentence written in elegant calligraphy. "We, too, have a corridor." Attached was a photograph of a narrow passage sealed with stone, just like Clara's. Over the months that followed, letters came in from Brazil, from Poland, from South Korea, and South Africa, all with the same echo: hidden corridors, lost voices, forgotten prayers. Clara had become the key that unlocked what others had long feared to confront. In response, the voice beneath launched a global initiative called the Clara Rooms, specially designated spaces in convents, seminaries, and churches where silence was not imposed, but explored. These rooms were quiet, but not empty. They held books, testimonies, journals, even recorded whispers from survivors. They weren't places of shame, but of presence. Places where silence finally had a witness. Back in the village, the chapel's guest book had to be replaced weekly. One message stood out among hundreds: "I came to see where she died, but I leave understanding how she lived." That message, written by a young man from New Zealand, was framed and placed in the chapel's entrance. It reminded all who entered that Clara's legacy was not the chamber, but the courage. And somewhere, on a quiet evening after the crowds had gone and the candles were down to flickering embers, Lucia sat alone in the chapel. She opened Clara's diary one more time, gently tracing the final page. There were no words there, just the impression of a pen, faint and unfinished, as if Clara had meant to say one more thing, but chose, instead, to let the silence carry it. The story of Clara Lucia Santoro would never have a formal ending. That, perhaps, was its greatest power. It lived on not as a tale with a closing chapter, but as a breath passed between those who had once been quiet and those who now dared to speak. Her life, marked by devotion, her disappearance, shrouded in mystery, and her legacy, resurrected through faith, had become a living parable. In time, schoolchildren would learn her name not in history books, but in lessons about truth. Artists painted her as light pouring through stone. Writers referenced her in poems about endurance. Activists carried her rosary on protest lines, not as a religious symbol, but as a reminder: truth may be silenced, but it never dies. And every time someone whispered the words, "I kept faith, even in silence," they weren't just honoring her, they were continuing her. The convent itself evolved into a center for spiritual reconciliation. No longer just a place of devotion, it became a sanctuary for the unheard. People came not to escape the world, but to face it with clearer eyes. And beneath the eastern corridor, where once stone concealed a prayer, now lay a narrow trail of lilies, freshly placed, gently lit, eternally tended. Lucia, in her final years, never sought titles, awards, or recognition. She often said, "I did not speak for Clara. I simply stopped pretending I couldn't hear her." Her last public appearance was at a gathering of young nuns, where she offered one final piece of advice: when you enter silence, do not fear what you'll hear. Fear what you'll miss if you refuse to listen. And so, long after the bells have stopped ringing, after the pilgrims have passed through and the corridors grow still once more, Clara remains. Not in stone, not in shadow, but in every moment someone dares to speak a truth the world told them to bury. In every voice that trembles but rises. In every silence that ends not in fear, but in faith. Years later, Long after the world had shifted and Clara's name had become an echo in books, films, and sermons, something unexpected happened. A group of young theologians at university in Prague began a research project tracing modern spiritual awakenings across the globe. They noticed something strange. Almost every movement of silent resistance or truth-telling had, somewhere in its foundation, a reference to Clara. Sometimes explicit, sometimes just a phrase. She kept faith, even in silence. One of the students, a woman named Hannah, decided to visit the village where it all began. She wasn't religious. She didn't come to pray. She came to understand how one woman, voiceless for over 30 years, had created a ripple strong enough to reach her across oceans and generations. She walked the eastern corridor. She touched the stone, and when she reached the plaque, she didn't cry. She stood still and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up." That moment, small and unseen, was recorded in her journal. She later wrote an article titled "The Nun Who Refused to Vanish," which became widely read not in religious circles, but among those studying trauma, silence, and resilience. Clara had transcended her role. She was now a case study in strength, in legacy, in what happens when a person, even buried, refuses to stay forgotten. Lucia, now retired and living in a small cottage near the woods, received a copy of the article by post. She read it by candlelight, hands trembling, not from age but from awe. "You've gone farther than I ever dreamed," she whispered aloud, as if Clara herself sat across the table. "They know you now, and they're still listening." In her journal that night, Lucia wrote only one line: "You were never the secret. You were the key." She closed the book gently, kissed the cover, and left it beside the window. The wind stirred slightly, brushing against the curtains, as if the night itself had paused to listen. Because even after all this time, Clara's story hadn't ended. It had only expanded. Meanwhile, back at the convent, new sisters continued to arrive, not to escape the world, but to better understand it. These women were different. They carried with them stories of survival, of justice, of questions that once would have been silenced. But now they were welcomed, guided not by rules alone, but by memory, by conscience, by the quiet strength of a woman who had once disappeared into stone, only to rise from it like light through a crack. One of the new novices, Sister Amara, stood out. Young, thoughtful, and fearless, she often sat for hours in the Clara room, studying the old journals and sketching quietly by candlelight. She said the silence there wasn't empty. It was full. "It doesn't scare me," she told the Mother Superior. "It feels like a heartbeat." One evening, she placed a small drawing beneath the glass case where the rosary rested. It showed Clara with her eyes closed, but smiling, peacefully, freely. The convent now held monthly gatherings called Noites de Voz, or Nights of Voice, inspired by a tradition that started in Brazil after Clara's story was translated into Portuguese. During these nights, people from all walks of life, clergy, artists, farmers, mothers, would come together to share a truth they had once buried. No judgment, no response, just presence, just listening. Clara had taught the world the power of being heard, and it was changing everything. In one such gathering, a young girl, no more than 10, stood up and spoke. She had been born deaf, and had only recently learned to express herself with sign language. With trembling hands, she signed, "Sometimes I feel like Clara. I speak, but no one listens." The room went silent, not out of awkwardness, but reverence. And then, one by one, the audience began signing back. "We hear you." That moment would later be etched into the chapel's wall beneath her mural. "We hear you." Clara's life had never been about a single act of defiance. It had been about faith, quiet, enduring, unshakable faith in the power of truth, no matter how long it takes to be seen. And now, through new voices, young hands, and old walls that once tried to muffle prayer, her voice continued, not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as a living presence in every soul who dares to speak. As the years turned into decades, Clara's name found its way into unlikely places: human rights conferences, reconciliation commissions, even literature classes where professors discussed the nature of silence in oppressive systems. Her legacy had leapt from the walls of a forgotten convent into the bloodstream of global conscience. No longer just a figure of faith, she had become a symbol of ethical defiance. And not by shouting, but by never allowing her silence to be the end of her story. One university in Canada developed an entire semester-long course titled The Theology of the Silenced, and Clara's writings formed the core of the syllabus. Students read her diary not as scripture, but as a philosophical manifesto, an exploration of conviction, conscience, and quiet courage. One student wrote in their final paper, "Clara didn't die in darkness. She became the voice inside it." That line was later quoted in a documentary about spiritual resistance in the 20th century. Meanwhile, back in the village, time moved slowly, but not without meaning. The seasons passed as they always had. The hills turned from green to gold. The candles were still lit each spring. But now, young children knew her name before they ever stepped into school. They knew it not because of obligation, but because of awe. She was their story, their protection, their inheritance. One boy, barely 6 years old, wandered into the eastern corridor during a family visit. He stood still, then turned to his father and asked, "Is this where she prayed even when she was scared?" His father nodded slowly, and the boy whispered, "I want to be brave like her." That moment, witnessed by Lucia from a distance, brought tears to her eyes. She knew then, Clara had reached the next generation, and not through doctrine, but through example. And in that simple hallway, once a place of darkness, now bathed in warm light, children's laughter could sometimes be heard echoing. Not loud, not irreverent, but soft and sacred, as if even the stones, once burdened by silence, had finally begun to exhale. That same spring, an international organization dedicated to preserving the stories of suppressed voices added Clara's Rosary to its permanent traveling exhibit. It toured museums, cathedrals, and cultural centers across 5 continents. People who had never stepped foot in a chapel stood in line to see it, not for religious devotion, but for human connection. They stared at it through glass and saw not beads, but history, proof that the unseen can become unforgettable. Alongside the Rosary sat an interactive panel displaying excerpts from Clara's diary. One particular entry struck a chord with visitors around the world. "If they erase my words, let them echo through the hands of those who find them. My voice is not only mine, it is theirs now." Many wept reading it. Others stood in silent reflection. And some, many of them young women, took out their phones and whispered her words into recordings, passing them on like sacred echoes in a digital age. One such visitor, a journalist from South Korea, was so moved that she pitched Clara's story to her network. It became a 3-part documentary series titled Echo Beneath the Veil. Upon airing, it sparked public discourse about spiritual abuse and silenced voices within institutional systems. Clara's name, translated phonetically in Korean, trended for 3 consecutive days. She had never crossed those borders in life, but her truth had now walked freely across them all. Back in the village, the convent had begun preserving digital scans of all surviving documents, creating a virtual sanctuary so Clara's story could reach even those who could never travel. The platform received thousands of visitors each month. Some came to read. Others came to leave their own stories behind. A message board was added, and on it, in dozens of languages, people wrote one common phrase: "You gave me courage." One day, Lucia visited the digital archive and read through the messages left anonymously. Near the top was one that simply said, "Clara, I told my truth today. For the first time. Thank you for going first." Lucia didn't reply. She only smiled, because she knew Clara would have understood. And that was enough. As Clara's legacy continued to ripple outward, institutions that once operated behind walls of silence began to shift. Some quietly reformed their practices. Others publicly acknowledged the weight of their past. A prominent seminary in Germany held a service called The Reckoning, where students and faculty read aloud names and stories of those once silenced. Clara's name was the first, not because her pain was the greatest, but because her voice had returned with such clarity that it cleared the path for. The Vatican, long cautious, surprised the world by announcing a global commission dedicated to the protection of spiritual conscience. an initiative inspired in part by the moral pressure and grassroots efforts rooted in Clara's story. Though her name wasn't included in the official documents, everyone knew. Her influence had made it into the highest corridors, not by protest, but by persistence, not by rage, but by remembrance. In the village, the convent bell tower underwent restoration. It was fitted with a new mechanism that allowed it to chime twice in a specific rhythm, once for Clara's voice and once for those still waiting to be heard. Every evening at sunset, the bells rang. Locals stopped whatever they were doing. Some whispered her name. Others said nothing, letting the sound speak for them. Even silence, now, was filled with meaning. One night, a storm rolled over the hills. Thunder cracked. Winds howled. Yet at precisely 7, the bells still rang, clear and undeterred. That night, a young girl named Elisa, who had recently moved to the village with her family, asked her mother, "Why do they ring even when the sky is angry?" Her mother bent down and replied, "Because her voice never stopped, even when the world did." That answer would stay with Elisa for the rest of her life. And in that moment, beneath the storm, something deeper was understood. Clara's story wasn't about a miracle. It wasn't about sainthood or scandal. It was about endurance. It was about choosing to believe that even the quietest truths can outlast the loudest lies, and that when one voice dares to rise in the dark, others will follow. Not immediately, not loudly, but always. The convent, once known only to the villagers and a few historians, was now a destination on spiritual and academic pilgrimages. Yet its grounds were never commercialized. No shops, no tickets, only open doors. The sisters insisted that Clara's story wasn't to be consumed, it was to be carried. Every guest received a small paper card with her most famous words printed at the bottom. "Let truth rise from stone, and let no one bury it again." Most visitors kept them. Some framed them. Some left them on O. One woman, a survivor of religious abuse from Chile, left behind her own rosary at the foot of Clara's mural. It wasn't for display. It was an offering, a gesture of passing strength from one soul to another. The convent didn't remove it. They simply added a line to the guest guide. Some truths arrive quietly. Let them rest where they land. During one particularly crowded vigil, a scholar named Raphael stood beside the plaque and began to quietly read a translation of Clara's diary in sign language. No one asked him to. No one interrupted. As his hands moved in graceful rhythm, the chapel remained utterly still. Among the crowd was a deaf boy who watched, eyes wide, lips trembling. His mother wept silently behind him. And later, the boy approached Raphael and signed, "I didn't know someone like her could speak my language." That evening, a new plaque was placed on the wall beneath Clara's. Her voice speaks every language, especially the ones without sound. From then on, every vigil included a silent reading, not just for those who could not hear, but for those still learning how to listen. As night fell on the convent that day, Lucia lit a candle and placed it on the eastern corridor's floor, right where Clara had once been found. She didn't pray. She didn't speak. She only sat, allowing the silence to do what it had always done in Clara's presence. Not hide, not hush, but hold. The following year marked what would have been Clara's 80th birthday. Though she had vanished at only 28, the world had come to know her far beyond her years. In preparation for the occasion, the convent planned something simple yet profound, a day of uninterrupted silence. No speeches, no music, no ceremonies, just open doors, candlelight, and room for reflection. For Clara's life, though rediscovered through words, had always spoken most powerfully through what was not said. That day, thousands around the world joined. Universities dimmed their lights. Churches removed their microphones. A hospital in Italy paused for a minute of complete stillness. Even a prison in Argentina, where inmates had read the Clara Testament as part of a rehabilitation program, held a silent meal. No one was told how to feel or what to think, only to listen to whatever surfaced in the hush. For in that stillness, Clara became not only remembered, but present. In the village, the eastern corridor filled with soft light as families walked through with children, some too young to understand the full weight of what had happened, but old enough to sense the reverence. One child, holding her grandmother's hand, stopped in front of the mural and whispered, She was brave like the stories in my books. Her grandmother squeezed her hand and replied, "No, sweetheart. The stories in your books are brave like her." That night, as the sun disappeared behind the hills, the convent bell rang twice as always. But after a long pause, a third chime sounded, slow, deliberate. It had never rung 3 times before. No one knew who added it. No one claimed credit. But everyone understood. The first was for her voice, the second for those she inspired, and the third for those still waiting to be found. Lucia stood at the edge of the corridor, tears welling in her eyes. She would have liked this, she whispered. Not the attention, the silence. Then she turned to walk the path Clara had once taken, each step echoing softly beneath the stone arches. And in the quiet, something inside her settled. Not closure, but peace. A kind of peace only found when the truth no longer needs to be spoken to be known. That same month, a young woman named Noor, a filmmaker from Lebanon, visited the convent to create a short documentary. She had grown up hearing whispers of Clara's story, but nothing had prepared her for the depth of what she felt inside those walls. It wasn't a story, she later said. It was a presence, as if every brick carried her breath. She arrived intending to film architecture, but left capturing transformation. Instead of traditional narration, Noor chose to let the documentary be told only through images, diary excerpts, and natural sound. A flickering candle, the wind brushing through lilies, pages of Clara's diary turning on their own, the sound of chalk writing on a board. She kept faith. There was no music, no interviews. And yet, when it premiered, the room fell into tears. She made silence cinematic, one critic wrote, and in doing so, gave Clara back the voice the world once buried. The documentary, titled The Corridor That Spoke, went on to win awards at international festivals. But more importantly, it opened doors in places where silence still ruled. After its screening in a monastery in northern India, 3 women came forward with hidden letters they had written decades before. The letters spoke of confinement, coercion, and prayer offered through tears. "Clara made us believe we weren't alone," one wrote. "And now we speak together." In the convent's records room, a new drawer was added, locked but not to hide. It was for those who wished to leave behind something too painful to share aloud. Letters, drawings, photos, names. They called it Clara's archive. Once a year, the drawer would be opened privately, and its contents read by one of the sisters, so that even the most fragile voices would be heard, even if only by one heart. And as the world changed, as new generations rose and others faded, Clara remained, not just in pages or plaques or prayers, but in choices, in pauses before judgment, in soft refusals to look away, in every person who, faced with silence, chooses not to fill it, but to honor it. Because Clara's greatest legacy was not what she endured, but what she awakened in those who listened. As the world grew louder, faster, more crowded, constantly moving, Clara's story stood still, unchanging, immovable. It became a kind of anchor for those drifting in uncertainty, a reminder that stillness does not mean absence, that quiet does not mean weak. Her name began appearing in unlikely places, etched into a stone near a Syrian refugee camp, embroidered in thread on the robe of a monk in the Andes, quoted on a wall in a women's shelter in Manila, not as part of a movement, but as a whisper of hope. A young poet in Morocco, having read the Clara Testament, published a collection titled Even in Silence. It featured voices of women across generations who had survived various forms of institutional abandonment. Each poem began with a phrase she did not speak, but followed by a memory, a wound, a triumph. The book was banned in some places, but it spread anyway. Online, handwritten copies, secret readings. Clara's silence had become a language without borders. One day, in the quiet hours of dawn, a nun named Sister Leona, barely 20, newly arrived at the convent, sat alone in the chapel, eyes fixed on Clara's rosary. She wrote in her journal, "They told me this place would help me hear God, but I think God is the one helping me hear her." She later read that line aloud during her first night of voice gathering. No one clapped, no one moved, but many wept, because Leona, without realizing, had spoken something millions had felt. Meanwhile, the Eastern Corridor continued to receive visitors from around the world. Among them was a woman in her 90s, pushed in a wheelchair by her granddaughter. She asked to be left alone for a moment, and, as the young girl stepped away, she leaned forward and whispered something to the plaque. Later, when asked what she said, the old woman replied, "I never told anyone what I saw. But you already knew, didn't you?" The candle she lit that day burned longer than any other. The sisters took it as a sign, not of mysticism, but of endurance, of a voice that, even after being locked behind stone for over 3 decades, had found a way to keep burning in the hearts of strangers who never met her, but somehow always knew her. In the 50th year since Clara Lucia Santoro disappeared, the world finally spoke her name aloud in places where it had once been forbidden. Cathedrals echoed her story in homilies. Schools taught her alongside names like Malala, Rosa, and Anne. But none of these honors were institutional. They were human, carried by breath, by heart, by quiet rebellion. And in the small village where it all began, preparations were made not for a ceremony, but for a sunrise. Before dawn, people gathered on the hill behind the chapel. No speeches were scheduled, no songs rehearsed, just a circle of lanterns forming a spiral, guiding each person down toward the Eastern Corridor. As they walked, they carried with them stones, each one etched with a word: truth, endure, light, listen, faith. They placed them one by one along the path, recreating the walkway Clara might have taken, step by step, breath by breath. At the heart of the spiral, where the old chamber once stood, there was nothing now but earth. It had been left bare, no plaque, no monument, just ground, pure and open. And there, in that empty space, a young child placed a single lily. No one had told her to. She just knew. As the sun rose, its first rays touched the petals, and for a moment, even the air stood still. Lucia, now nearing the end of her days, stood at a distance watching the scene unfold. She whispered words only the wind would hear. "You were never meant to be found, Clara. You were meant to be followed." And then, with a soft smile, she turned toward the horizon, her footsteps slow but certain. Because the story had never truly been about a nun in 1981. It had always been about us. What we fear, what we bury, what we choose to remember. And so, long after the crowd had dispersed, after the candles had flickered into soft smoke, Clara remained. In stone, in silence, in every voice that trembles but speaks, in every moment when someone chooses to listen. She had once disappeared, but now she lived on, in every truth that refuses to stay buried. Clara's story does not end in the stone corridor where her voice was once lost. It begins there, because what she left behind is not merely a mystery solved or a tragedy remembered, but a legacy that continues to unfold in the hearts of those brave enough to listen. Her silence was never emptiness. It was a seed, and today, that seed has blossomed into a global testament of conscience, courage, and unshakable faith. In every hand that dares to write the truth, in every heart that refuses to look away. Clara, we live in a world that often confuses noise with power, but Clara showed us the opposite. She taught us that sometimes the strongest voices are the ones spoken in stillness. The most profound change begins not in headlines or declarations, but in quiet rooms, in whispered prayers, in a decision to no longer be afraid. Her life reminds us that the measure of a person is not what they endure, but what they awaken in others through that endurance. And now, her voice belongs to you, to each of us, in the way we protect the vulnerable, in the way we respond when someone speaks the truth others would rather bury, in the way we treat silence, not as an excuse to turn away, but as an invitation to lean in. Clara was not trying to be remembered. She was simply trying to be heard. And in honoring that, we become part of something greater than a single story. We become keepers of light in darkened places. So the question that lingers is not what happened to Clara, but what happens to us when we hear her. Do we carry her truth forward? Do we break our own silences? Do we become what she could not live long enough to see? Because the bells that ring for her now do not toll a morning. They echo with responsibility. And every time we choose to speak, to listen, to act with integrity, we ring them again. If this story moved you, if Clara's voice stirred something inside you, let that be the beginning of your own. Subscribe to this channel to follow more stories that reveal what others have tried to forget. Leave a comment sharing what part of Clara's journey spoke to you most. And if you feel this truth should be heard by more hearts, let it travel, like her voice did, by sharing it forward. Because stories like hers don't belong to the past. They belong to all of us.